Generically good is how I describe Reverse 1999 in the fewest words possible. As the game that won the top spot for the best casual category in my top 6 gachas of 2026 video, I actually don't see many opinion pieces on the game that's not sponsored these days. Reverse 1999 is a gacha game that will get the occasional mention for one of the best gacha games you can play, but doesn't really have that much cultural impact on the genre, just that it's a game that does many things right, but not much else aside from that. I personally play it for many months and have accumulated a pretty sizable roster, though there are times where I just stop playing for a few months and only come back when there's a big event or something. My name is Psyche, and I think it's about time to do a dedicated video on this gacha game that surprisingly does a lot of things right while staying consistent over the years. Now, despite me having spent a lot of time on the game, this is not a traditional long-form review like what I normally do on the channel, as Reverse 1999 is approaching the mainstream level in terms of gacha games, and I don't intend to do reviews of games like that where I cover absolutely everything. I will be going over the basics of gameplay, progression, gacha, and events, but we'll just kind of be glancing through them without going into too much detail. Let's begin. I first joined the game in version 1.3, and I tend to log back like once every couple months. The game has changed a lot, and that's mainly due to them realizing global localization is important and how the gameplay is quite prone to power creep. I'll cover all of this later. The game is developed by Bluepock, and they've announced going the mainstream route with their next project where they're making a new game that's 3D and open world. I guess that's every gacha developer's dream these days. Fund a game well enough so you can make an open world game after that. Anyways, Reverse 1999 first launched in late 2023, so it's been around 2.5 years. The story follows Vertin, the timekeeper, as she tries to figure out why time seems to be reversing to a previous era after it failed to pass the second millennium via something called the Storm. A mysterious group called the Manus Vindictae seems to be behind this phenomenon, but it's unsure why they do this just yet. There's a whole foundation that aims to research the storm and how to prevent it. The story will take you to various areas across history and how this alternate timeline has branched off from the real world. For example, due to interference from the Manus, the peace talks during World War I never happened, so the war dragged on for longer than what it was supposed to. Now, I have a few comments on the story itself. Personally, I would say it narrowly passes my top 10 gacha game stories list. What I quite like is that Vertin is not a self-insert. She has a backstory that's actually explained in the very early chapters, instead of taking like 15 chapters to get there, where the protagonist's past is just left vague. That being said, I'd say that the world of Reverse 1999 feels good to be a part of. Its pure story quality is just decent if you ask me. Chapter 7 was the only chapter that actually kept me hooked all the way through, and that's mainly due to it being the climax of the first arc that keeps the characters from the previous chapters and actually develops them. The rest of the story is just kinda self-contained within its own chapters and doesn't really have the grand feeling as this one. It also suffers from a case of poor localization in its early story chapters. The first two are pretty bad since I can tell they wanted to explore some cool ideas, but had some issues translating those ideas into English. The first couple event stories fall into the same category, as some dialogue are just straight up incoherent, and some character underwent changes as the developers probably didn't know certain nuances in non-Chinese languages. I mean, your main sidekick Sonetta used to be British, but they changed their mind in the same cutscene.
To ask, but I was wondering if you would like to take a heritage train ride with me. Don't worry, Timekeeper. Although his manner is debatable, he's not a bad person.
Story is one of the few things you can't fix unless you commit to a full rewrite. Whatever is there in the beginning of the game will be there until the game shuts down. While it's not unheard of to change the story, it's probably just better off using the same resources to make new content that the majority of the players actually want. You can enjoy the quality voice acting, as opposed to Arknights, where the English voiceovers actually use the characters' native accents, and it's one of the few gacha games I prefer to play in the English dub. The gameplay is turn-based, and it's fairly generic, but it does have a few quirks to it. Each character only has 2 cards and an ult. You're only allowed to play a certain number of cards per turn, and they're played in order. If 2 identical cards are adjacent, they'll merge and gain a star rank, which can go up to 3, raising its effectiveness. When a card is played or merged, that character gets a Moxie point. Filling up to 5 gives you their ult skill in the spell dock. Some characters have unconventional playstyles and may not always follow these mechanics, but for the most part, that's the core of the game. The gacha that's the closest comparison to Reverse 1999 is Fate Grand Order, which also has you choose 3 actions per turn, and enemies have an ult gauge that's filled gradually per turn. There's a functional elemental system where you deal a bit more damage if you have the advantage, and this does tend to matter a bit in the late game challenge modes. Most normal fights will have you use 3 units at a time, while a 4th exists to replace the first unit that goes down, but most late game fights will have you use 4 units at once. That's kinda in terms of the core mechanics. There are many archetypes and playstyles, of course, but you can just auto most of the story content if your team is good enough. Unfortunately, power creep is alive and well in this game, and the degree of it seems to be more severe than some other gacha games I've played. For a bit of disclosure, I remember playing during the early days, and certain 5-star picks used to be able to contend with the 6 stars. Now, you can still use them as a stepping stone when you first begin, but their power class has remained stagnant while the damage ceiling keeps on rising. While it's true that they do buff units post-launch, in almost the same fashion as Arknights, they generally give priority to the limited 6 stars, while the lower rarities rarely get anything, if at all. A good number of 5 stars and maybe even some of the 4 stars could be good enough to run in certain cases when the game launched, but now they're just lagging behind and you basically only want 6 stars, with the exception of a few 5 stars that launched recently. Of course, you can argue that every gacha game will have to face elements of power creep when it goes on for long enough, and that the meta picks are only really relevant for the late game modes that don't give that many Gamba coins even if you fully clear it. Is the challenge content well designed? Well, not if you want actual mechanical depth. You're graded based on how many turns you took to beat it, so any unit that can win in fewer turns will be considered objectively better than those that can't clear it in that many turns. However, I placed Reverse 1999 in the best casual category in my top 6 video for a reason. I think it's absolutely valid to want something to unwind to after a long day and just have the game play itself for you. While it is possible to try theory crafting or challenging yourself by using lower rarity units, having the current meta units is basically an instant win button. Speaking of which, I have personally fully cleared the late game challenge stages on several occasions. Okay, challenge is a bit of a stretch since I'm pretty sure if you have the most meta teams and the stage buff happens to shield the current rate up character, you might even be able to auto it. I literally just had the 2 most meta teams at the time and managed to breeze through those. I mean, I didn't have any character dupes, so I guess you can argue that the game is so casual that the dupes are really not necessary. Anyways, the late game mode that you actually want to clear is this one called Reveries in the Rain. This gives you the currency to buy the stuff needed to activate the post-launch buffs of a unit, so you would have to scrounge together multiple teams to get the most significant rewards. There is a truly endgame challenge mode where the difficulty ramps up as you go deeper, but most of it is just for bragging rights. I must say, this is also the only mode in the game where the level mechanics actually nudge you to approach it in a specific playstyle. In most cases, both the story and late game content are incredibly easy difficulty-wise, which makes for a low-stakes environment if you don't want to use your brain in a gacha game. Again, nothing wrong with that. You're mostly playing this for the world and vibes. Just don't play this game thinking you're getting high skill ceiling gameplay like Arknights or Morimans. Reverse 1999 modeled its progression system from Arknights, and I wish there were others that did the same. You can just replay the level for farming mats after you beat it once, and you have ascension stages to farm for. The only difference is that the insight level goes up to 3 instead of 2 from Arknights. You can level the stats to 15, but most of the time 10 is enough. You get these Tetris pieces to fit onto a grid that give more stats, and the higher the level, the bigger the grid. The striking point why Reverse 1999 is such a standout is that there's no RNG gearing to speak of, just like Arknights. You can fit a piece of gear called the side tube onto your characters, but these are just bought in the shop, and there's no separate gacha banner for it. Most of the ones for the current rate-up characters are bought from the event shop. Everything is incredibly streamlined, and I think Reverse 1999 is up there among the top as a game with some of the best quality of life features. You know those complex crafting materials for high-end upgrades? Well, given that they need a combination of other materials of varying rarity, you can actually just craft everything in one go if you had enough of the requirements. Post-launch buffs for older characters do exist called Euphorias, but you have to farm for a separate currency to unlock it and another to level it. Some of these are pretty impactful, so if you want your favorites to keep up with the power creep, you'll likely have to work for it, but generally, the newest released units will be the top tiers. It also doesn't match Arknight's dupe system. They do give additional effects rather than a stat boost only, so expect some of the dupe levels to matter a bit. There are ways to get a dupe token for free these days, but it's super rare and you can't use it on everyone. There's the Wilderness Tycoon mode where you can build a base and get more passive materials, but I never paid too much attention to this. You can train up these critters and have them work in your sweatshop. You can set up roads and transport routes to make production easier, and the decorations can be bought from the shop using its own currency. I guess every single game needs to have a dorm mode, so this will be your main sandbox if you're into that. The gacha system is also one of the reasons why it made my top list for gacha games. The character rarity goes up to 6 stars, and the rules are very similar to many modern gachas. 50-50 rate up, you get the rate up guaranteed if you miss it the first time, and the pity carries over. The odds of getting a 6 star isn't as high as Arknight's 2%, so it's likely you'll go to pity most of the time. What is deserving of praise is that there's no weapon banner, and non-limited characters will be part of the standard pool after 3 patches or around 3 to 4 months. Usually, only the anniversary units are truly limited and you have to wait for a rerun for those. However, just like Arknights, it's to your best interest to save a bunch of Gamba coins for those limiteds, as they're generally more powerful than the other 6 stars. I overall have good impressions of gacha systems that rotate in standard characters, but they will sell more power when the limited characters do arrive. You're not gonna get shower with poles in this game, so you either have to buy the $5 monthly or just save up maybe every other patch. Just like how I described Arknight's system, it's not the most generous, but it's fair. I also quite like the Battle Pass, since it does give out a skin if you do buy the premium track. I've bought this a few times, and if you don't end up getting it, some of them will get moved to the shop. Otherwise, the other deals in the cash shop are just pretty typical for a gacha game. They give the usual whale bait and other cosmetic items. Nothing really to note here. If you were to sum up my overall impressions of the game, there's one core aspect of it that I enjoy a lot, and why it's, in my opinion, one of the best casual gacha games you can play. That goes to the atmosphere and the overall coziness you feel when interacting with its world and other systems. The sound design is impeccable, and it's one of those games where you'll need some headphones to hear it at its full potential. The main lobby music has like 9 different variations, and some of the tracks in the game are really atmospheric and fit the tone of the setting. It also went the extra mile to voice the story and has live 2D for all of its characters. There's some unique character designs, but generally the more wacky ones are the lower rarities, so the game can say how quirky and unique it is, while the waifus and husbandos remain the 6 stars. What's more, the dub also matches the accent of the character if you use the English voiceovers. In my opinion, this took Arknight's idea and ramped it up even more, since you can actually hear them in action as the story is fully voiced, whereas in Arknights you kinda just have to imagine it. I think when you dedicate to having your entire game being voiced, it also presents a challenge that silent stories don't have. If you have a budget of like 20,000 on voice actors, then you would have to write the story in a way where the scenario is exciting, but also keeping the dialogue short and concise so you don't overshoot the budget. If there's no voicing, then you can just go on for way longer, with dialogue that keeps going line after line. I believe in the concept that it's a skill in writing to convey as much meaning in as few words as possible. If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. That being said, story is still incredibly subjective, so there's no set rules on how to write one. The game also keeps it consistent with the 6-week schedule. This has more or less been the norm in gacha games these days, where after every month or so, you're expected to have a significant update with all sorts of minigames and event stories. This is a pretty tall order for any small development company, but it just goes to show how demanding things are these days. The side content themselves are just fairly easy, and most of them are repeatable in some way that you can play them multiple times. I think any roguelike game mode the game comes up with is just kinda whatever. I thought the one that's permanently available didn't really interest me that much, but you do get some sweet rewards from playing it. You're not really gonna have the hardest gameplay or the deepest of mechanics, just that each story segment is interesting and digestible, and the combat stages can mostly be autoed. If you're wondering about fear of missing out, past event stories are preserved, but they only show up like a couple months afterwards. You can kinda see the evolution of how the game improved its localization if you viewed the events chronologically, though some of those older events are gonna be quite rough to read if you're already used to the recent ones. It's only natural that a lot of the game's systems have been expanded upon over the years, but I do think the game should be careful not to have content creep to the point where it becomes too overwhelming to new players. So where do I stand on Reverse 1999? It's an incredibly polished game with amazing visual and auditory presentation. The story is not the best from a pure writing perspective, but it's engaging and concise while complemented by the casual gameplay. Don't expect the most unique or challenging late game modes, as the game has the turn count as the measurement of your success. So naturally, the characters on the gacha rate up will have an advantage. Even so, the progression system feels fair and quick due to having no RNG gearing, and the lack of weapon gacha makes it easier to focus on the characters instead. It still holds the spot for the best casual game in my rankings, and I suspect it'll take quite a bit for another game to change that. With the funding of this game, we will see in the distant future how Blue Pock's open world game will fare. That about does it for my time in Reverse 1999. It's a game I'll reinstall once in a while to check back on it, but the content within it feels engaging enough that I can't see it being someone's forever game. Let me know what you think. If you want to catch more gacha related content like this, subscribe to the channel. You can support for as little as $2 a month on Patreon. As always, thank you for watching, be sure to spend moderately, and have fun out there.